Hello, in this module we will discuss complementary foods, which is solid foods and fluids other than breast milk or formula. The purpose of complementary feeding is to provide additional energy and nutrients when the needs of the infants cannot be met with breast milk or formula alone. So when is that time? So in developed countries, and particularly in the US, there is this population-based guideline that first foods can be introduced between 4 and 6 months. This is slightly different than the WHO recommendation for 6 months, so exclusive breastfeeding can be allowed for up to 6 months. Every child is different, and there are several developmental milestones that have to be met before we can introduce solid foods, and those are in line with the energy needs of the infant. So the infant that is ready to start eating solids is the infant that can sit well with support, can control moving their head, can open their mouth when food is offered, and generally show interest in food if they see a parent or a caregiver eating something. The infant at this point can take food from a spoon and swallow the food, and when they are full they can turn their head to refuse the food. Again, these are some general signs that there is developmental readiness. So some recommendations for introducing the complementary foods and some things to remember for the parents, for the caregiver, so the whole process is going to be as smooth as possible. Generally, feeding babies solids, especially in the beginning, can be an exercise of patience, you can say. And even with well-developed babies, there are challenges. So it's not a good idea in general to introduce new things when a baby is tired or they are hungry and they are impatient to eat the food. So just prefer times that the babies are well rested and they're not as hungry. Maybe what some mothers would do, they would breastfeed the baby and then they would offer some new food for the first time, and since the baby will be fed, then they're not hungry and they'll be rested, they'll be more open to this new experience. So with feeding, the infant has to get used to different elements. So it's a completely new experience, and it's very different from the breast or the bottle that they've been used to for 4 or 5 months or 6 months. The spoon, for example, is not soft or is not warm, and generally the oral sensation that they're going to get with the food that is offered with a spoon is going to be very different. So it's not unusual for babies to try to suck the foods from the spoon in the same way that they would suck milk from either the breast or the bottle. Generally, mess and spillage is expected, and the first few times there is more food that appears to be spilled rather than swallowed, and it's important to pay attention to the responsiveness of the baby and to make sure that that the spoon is used in an appropriate way. So also see whether the baby can extend the tongue further out than the lower lip. If they cannot, that's a sign that the baby is not ready for spoon feeding, actually. Scrubbing the spoon on infant's gum is not a good idea. It doesn't make for a pleasant experience, so it's something that should be avoided. The gag reflex, it's something that can be really easily triggered in infants, especially if there is not care, so the spoon doesn't go too far back in the mouth. So it's good to try to place the spoon on front of the tongue and slightly pressing down the tongue, so to facilitate that movement of the tongue backwards. The pace has to be adjusted, so according to what the baby needs and how interested they are in that particular feeding session. And generally pushing food into the baby's mouth, it's not a good idea because it can increase choking and overall make this experience unpleasant for the baby. And probably they will remember that the next time that you try to feed them. Now, in terms of some quantities here and some numbers, we should start with small volumes. So 5 to 6 baby spoons is good for a start. That is the equivalent of 2 tablespoons. So it's a very small amount compared to adult portion sizes. Now, as far as for how long we should try to feed a baby in the first time or the first few times that we try to feed them solids, it really depends on how interested they are, but it should be short in duration, so no more than 10 minutes. It may seem like a very long 10 minutes, but this should be enough time to allow the baby to sort of reconsider, but also for the caregiver to feel comfortable doing this for about 10 minutes. Now, something very important is how the infant is going to sit, but also how the person that is feeding them is going to sit right across them. So the infant's position is very important, not just to make them comfortable, and when babies are comfortable, they're going to be more playful and more open to what they do, but also for safety reasons, because you want to minimize chances of choking, and you also want to minimize ear infections, which are possible if babies sleep and they are taking milk from the bottle. So there are certain things that one should be cautious about. So the baby being comfortable means that there are more chances that the feeding will be successful, that if they don't get tired while they are sitting, since they will have good support and they are sitting in an appropriate high chair, which is really great, a great commodity to have, which wasn't available, I guess, a generation ago or so. It was very uncomfortable for both the parent or the caregiver and the baby to be fed when they were held in the lap. There wasn't enough eye contact, so everything was more challenging. But the high chair definitely makes a big difference. So the feet also should be supported, just so they can be flexed and they are not hanging and causing unnecessary discomfort. So social interactions during feeding, this is important for adults. It's probably even more important for babies, that they are still exploring their world and they're learning, and they can associate this positive social interaction with a positive feeding experience overall. So making directly eye contact with the baby is really important. Things like cell phones or TV or other noises should be minimized to the extent possible, and this is something that will enable both the parent and the baby to focus on that activity. So the position and the surrounding for the feeding experience are important. Now, another element to consider in solid foods is the food texture, and in line with the development of the baby. So you do want to start with solid foods that are soft, very soft in texture, and soft and smooth and sort of homogeneous, and then you can progress gradually towards mashed foods and then towards ground foods, and eventually you want the baby to transition into eating table foods, which is whatever the rest of the family is eating, which is something that can be done between the 9th and the 12th months. So there needs to be a progression in food texture in line with infant development. That's important to facilitate the whole feeding experience. So in general, it's considered that foods that are appropriate for infants, they shouldn't require much chewing. Babies have their first teeth in a different point in their first year, so some baby may have teeth when they are 6 months, and you can have babies that they don't have teeth up until they're 10 months old. So generally you want to have foods that can be processed in their mouth without really a lot of chewing. So chewing skills generally are not developed until the toddler years, and swallowing functions even later. So for some children is up to when they are 8 that they can swallow to the full extent. And another thing to note here is that gagging and choking can be very common in infants. So texture is really important to prevent those things from happening. So what we expect is that when the babies are 6, so this is when they will start eating their first solid foods, and for a lot of them can be pureed foods. So this would be a similar texture with infant cereal that sometimes you can mix with milk, either breast milk or formula or water. So something that is semi-liquid, semi-solid, and it's in a pureed form. Later, by 8 months, they can swallow lumpy foods. So here the texture can be less homogeneous, but still you're required to have soft food. And then when they are, and later by the 10 months, they can eat soft mashed food. So the same food item can be prepared in different forms, and that is not going to change the flavor, but the texture is definitely going to help and improve the eating experience, but also prevent hazards of choking. So what is it that we can feed, and when? So there are some general recommendations that have been followed traditionally in countries like the US or other countries, but these are practices that are considered common, but they are subject to change. So in line with their physical readiness, in line with their increased needs for energy or iron or zinc or other trace minerals. So we do start with cereal, and typically we prefer a rice cereal. It's considered less benign in terms of allergies, rice versus the other grains. And those baby foods, those are fortified with iron. So especially for breastfed infants, supplementing with iron is important. So it's sometimes some parents would choose to start iron fortified rice cereal even at 4 months, just so they can increase the intake of iron in breastfed babies. So later, other cereal can be introduced. For example, oat can be introduced later. Wheat is typically delayed, so you consume wheat later. Pureed fruits and vegetables, you try to choose. There is a variety of fruits and vegetables that you can choose from, but you basically try to avoid citrus fruits or fruits like strawberries. Generally, fruits that are considered that can cause allergies in babies. When babies are 7 to 10 months, you can prepare fruits and vegetables, you can mash them, you can strain them, and then you can start giving other foods like the egg yolk. You can change the texture of some table foods and adapt it to the babies. You can take meat or chicken, and then you can make it into tiny pieces, or you can use a food processor to change the texture, and therefore just give it to the babies. And then later, by the first year, it's expected that the baby can eat other things too. And generally, a lot of table food, a lot of family food, cooked food, in however soft combinations. We still need to make sure that the texture is appropriate. Things like mac and cheese, yogurt and cheese can be introduced at this stage.